Water is life. Water is sacred. Water is purifying. Water is refreshing. Water is our first medicine. I was taught that a very long time ago. Water is our first medicine. When you have nothing else, water. Sipping the water. Water will take you where you need to go, emotionally and mentally. We carry a memory, and water carries a memory. And when they come together and we're sipping water, we are being reminded of who we are. I was always taught water refreshes the spirit as well as the body.
Water is the most important of all things. It is the giver of life. When you look at water, it's the reason why this planet is so special and unique. Everything that lives here relies on that water. Water is the first of all living things. And in our creation, or our Tamanwit Tamawit, that is the creation of the foods, of how the foods first came forward. All the people and the animals came together in an area, and they discussed how they were going to give themselves to each other. And so the water was the first of all things. And the salmon came forward. And when the salmon came forward, they gave their life to the people. In return, they asked that the people would celebrate them. Every year they would come back, and their bodies would nourish us. And then the roots came forward, and they gave testimony. And then the berry species came forward, and they gave testimony. Everything that we are is related to those foods.
First foods is critical to water. They are intimately linked together. So it's not only feeding the body, but it's feeding the soul. It's feeding the spirit. It's feeding our mental health and our emotional health.
We have that connection with them, and that's important to them, and it has to be there. If that water's not there in the river, or the river's too low, those fish are gonna die. And with that, so does our language and our culture. When those foods are no longer there, our people will become sick also because we're stopped eating them, and you see that. And so our people are sick. And not only that, the water is sick.
Part of our path to recovering our health, or what I call recovery from discovery, includes recovering our health through our first foods. So it's critical, it's central.
It's important that we look at the purity of our water and working to clean that water and make that one of our priorities on this world, because once that water becomes to a place we can't drink it no longer, even if we're filtering it, there's still things making us all sick. And why wouldn't that be one of the most important things? Because that is the reason why this planet is so special.
Excuse me, could I stop and ask you a couple of questions about water?
Yeah, of course.
Where does your drinking water come from?
Do you mean like from the tap or from like around?
My faucet sink, I guess.
I'm going to leave the engineers to be responsible for that. It's too complicated to understand.
If the water, when it rains, goes down one of those drains right there, do you know where that water goes?
My answer would be no.
As far as where that all happens, I'm not sure.
We're often disconnected from water because we don't have to go get it. It used to be that we'd have to go find a clean source of water, see everything that's interacting with it, make sure it's a good place to drink from, and go actually obtain that water. And now there's an expectation. We can just turn on the tap and we know good, clean water is coming out of there. Yeah, it wasn't until after graduate school that I even learned where the water goes when it rains, after it goes down into the catch basin and disappears. I didn't realize that almost all of that water goes directly into the nearest stream or wetland. And sort of that realization that I hadn't learned that, that hadn't been taught to me in school, hadn't been taught to me by my parents, and when I asked my parents, they didn't really know.
I think in many ways we've lost our sense of belonging because we've closed ourselves off from nature, so we don't see it, or we understand it only as a cultivated piece of land.
It feels like things were built against nature, but not like working with nature. So, like, there's always been human influence, but there is a way to influence your environment without working against it.
I think as we live an urban life, our direct connection to water, to rainfall disappears.
So Willamette Falls is a really fascinating waterfall. It's right upstream of the confluence of the Clackamas and Willamette River. Europeans established this area. It was one of the first to be built up. So a lot of people that are locals don't even know that it exists.
The electrical grid started here with transmission from this hydropower plant into Portland, but kind of disconnecting it from its early moments when it was a place of Native American culture and importance.
That's not sustainable. The things that got built on these rivers, the things that were done to these rivers, in the time of a mountain, they're the time of an ant. I can't speak for how ancestors may have been pondering who are these people who don't seem to have a relationship with water, water as waste, or water as something to control. We've lost so much.
They were taking them and trying to make us be disconnected from our own culture, our own religion, because they had been disconnected before they even hit this country. We are going to kill the Indian and save the man.
And so you have a culture that practices a colonizing methodology. Instead of looking at water as priceless, or even looking at it as a relative, who puts a price on their mother, you have folks that came in and saw what there was, took it all in just a few generations, and were thinking about how their great-great-great-grandchildren were going to live here. So turning waterways into really toilets, water became a way to carry away to the next, downriver poisons and killing all the fish, killing all the other relatives, which we do have a relationship with and we have a responsibility to. It was kind of head-scratching, like, don't you need water to drink? Or how did that disconnect happen?
So now all those fixes that came 100, 150 years ago, we're having to fix because they did not know this land. They didn't want to listen to anybody else. And so now we're working as a whole country. How do we fix these things that we created? And so the disconnection is because you come to a land to try to manage something you don't know. Everybody loves to go swimming and loves to go to water, recreational. So I think a lot of people still have connection recreational. They just might not see it in that cultural way that we do. Or they know that it's important, but they don't always think about it that much because we forget to teach them or they just haven't been taught about it.
The more people that come down to the river and have a positive experience, the more people will be connected to the water that's flowing past their community and the importance of it.
A big part of what I do now in my job is trying to bring that knowledge to everyone, and especially teach it at a really young age. There's a cool mural project in downtown Gresham here where we have school kids draw murals around the catch basins and the rain gardens to show this is where the water is going. So that connection is established really early on. So as those children grow up, they always know that that's where that goes and to make sure to keep that water clean. The indigenous peoples who lived on this land lived here at least for thousands of years, if not for time immemorial, and they knew how to live with the land. But understanding which of those principles can be used and how can we live in a way that is more in tune with the land and so that it can continue to provide for us.
Indigenous communities have decided to share more because we are all in this together. The boundaries between our homelands and others are, water doesn't recognize those boundaries. It's flowing, inviting folks to participate and recognize that this is their home too now, and we'll have to be willing to live here in a good way and recognize what indigenous people have been doing since time immemorial.
You know, in a lot of places, the drinking water is from a river, and if we don't know where that's coming from, it's harder to understand that, okay, if there are, you know, pesticides washing off of my lawn or, you know, chemicals coming out of my car that wash right into the river, those are coming back to me. I'm coming back and drinking those. So understanding that that water is connected is really important for everyone's health.
I think it's important to know how we've been disconnected because it leads us towards a reconnection.
The way water works with photographing animals is it's a little bit more unique than just land. To really understand what's there, you have to spend a bit of time and watch it. A shimmer of silver may indicate, oh my gosh, there's a fish there. If I see big, deep, undulating waves coming out of the bank, I get my camera and I stay there and I wait because I know a beaver's gonna come out. The first thing my husband and I noticed when we got here is it's a great environment. There's this beautiful creek, there's these grand woods. I looked at that creek and saw just a pair of mallard ducks swimming down it and thought, perfect. If that's all I ever see when I'm here, I'll be content. Not a few months later, we saw a family of otters swimming down the creek. And I phoned up the Johnson Creek Watershed Council and they said, that is so great in Gresham, but did you get a photograph? At that point, I determined to go out and buy myself a camera and start cataloging what was coming down the creek. Putting the photos up and sharing them immediately engaged people. That encouraged me, just keep going, take more pictures, show more people. It's not so much that they're my photos, but it's a photo that's starting a real dialogue and an interest. To just talk is one thing, but to get people engaged with the environment is another thing entirely. To encourage them to be outside heightens the awareness of the environment, how to care for it, and the knowledge that these animals are neighbors. There's a piece with just being in the environment, listening, looking, and sensing. I think the simplest way for people to reconnect with the rivers in particular is to go down to the bank and touch one. Take hold of it. What's it like? Feel it running through your fingers. Once you've felt that, I think, you understand how visceral experience can be. You connect to a childlike understanding of just being with everything, of taking enjoyment in looking at water, taking enjoyment of having no shoes on, walking on wet grass. It's a real sense of we already belong to it because we're part of this system, this interbeing, this integrated and natural world. And I don't want people to ever feel that they are just observers. They take an active role with the water, with the river. It's not just the creek doing its thing. You do something too. It could be beneficial, could be detrimental. It's consequential.
My name is Marisha Jackson. I go by MJ. I live in Portland, Oregon, kind of in downtown, and I typically reconnect with water by running to the waterfront. I run with a run club called Deadstock Run Club that always runs on the waterfront. It's really hard sometimes, when you're new to a place to meet people, And in a place like Portland, it can also be hard to like find a lot of Black people, brown people, diverse groups of people. And so Deadstock kind of provides both of those things. Rivers are a natural running route. You can do an out and back, you're not gonna get lost, you just follow the water. And then it's also just so aesthetically pleasing. It's like one of my favorite things to live now in a city that has like such a strong kind of path along the river. My view of what it means to reconnect with water has changed since childhood, but I'm not sure exactly when that shift happened. As I got older, I remember I started taking long walks and I was like, I'm just gonna start calling this a hike because I don't know where I can hike nearby, but I lived in a really hilly area in Los Angeles and I was like, this is basically hiking. So I would tell people like I go on urban hikes. Me as a Black woman in particular, it's like, you know, whenever you saw people that looked like me in natural areas, it wasn't necessarily in a leisurely fun context. It's like we're slaves, we're being, you know, lynched. I just do think that there's something inside that's like, okay, like this kind of environment is scary for people like me. I do think though, being able to start things the way I wanted to start things, and instead of shutting myself down and being like, okay, well that's just not for me, but instead being like, well, I'm just gonna do it in a way that's comfortable for me, helped me get to a point of being like, okay, I'll risk it. One of my favorite things is being able to just walk through like city parks. Small city parks, big city parks, it doesn't matter. I'm very much an aimless wanderer a lot in the places I live in. One of my favorite parks is Tanner Springs Park. There's like these like wetland type grasses and there's a lot of information on the signs in the park to tell you about the history of it. Even if it's through like a micro habitat or like a park like Tanner Springs, when you feel like you've connected with it in some way, you're more likely to make decisions that'll help protect it. Maybe it hits home for you more how finite all of these resources are. Whether you want to identify as outdoorsy or not, we're still part of the world's ecosystem, even in our cities. I think it's so easy to think of city and country as like two separate things, and I think we're actually all interconnected, and I think if we can all start acting as if we're interconnected and believing that we're interconnected, it'll be easier for us to make better decisions for the world.
Water is the essence of all things, and we're constantly working at being able to reconnect to our first foods, to the water, to everything that's related to our Tumanwat. And our Tumanwat is the story of the water and the first foods.
Wapato is a great story of a first food. As Lewis and Clark came through this way, they logged that Native women were gathering Wapato from the sediment, from the mud. It's another healthy source of carbohydrate. The first thing that disrupted Wapato was taking Native people off their lands and corralling them. Our first foods require tending. When you take indigenous people off the land, they've been doing a sophisticated, low-impact tending of the land in a seasonal, respectful way.
Culturally, Wapato was a main staple of many tribes in the area.
Wapato is very water-centered and likes to grow in the mud and floodplains. A lot of colonizing practices across the country disrupt water flow. There's a great story with the Yakama Nation on the Wapato coming back on their land once European agricultural practices were stopped.
And so they're like, okay, well, let's repair this wetland and bring it back to a wetland and reestablish it. So they reestablished the area, and a year later, what came up was Wapato. We had to go search for it, and someone said, okay, we located over by Richland, Kennewick, and there's this spot. Go over to this area. So we grabbed our buckets and shovels. We're like, well, if we can find it, maybe we can dig it up and see, what it's like, because none of us had ever gathered it. Sure enough, we found it. We got down there in the mud, we started digging it. The water started moving, and you started seeing all these thousands of seeds passing by us. So when you're looking at the interaction when we're getting back to foods, is that we help with their production.
The reemergence of wapato and other plants that are coming up reminds me that we're not doing this work alone. We never were. They are our elders.
The reconnection of us going to fish, going to find wapato, going to find foods, especially on the river, is a reconnection not only to the water, but to culturally significant places that relate to the connection to water, to people, to culture, to the basis of life of where we live.
When you just relax and enjoy the environment, there's a calming effect that can raise an awareness, an understanding of life's flow. There's a poetry to it.
I feel like it's important for people to connect with rivers, water, and just a general habitat, because when you feel like you've connected with it in some way, you might be more likely to support those higher level decisions that would lead to the protection of natural resources. Collectively, there needs to be a much larger shift so that we're all invested in it.
Water doesn't recognize boundaries. It's flowing, inviting folks to participate. This is their home too now, and they will have to be willing to live here in a good way.